He walked into that room wearing a 10-year-old jacket and shoes that had seen better days, and every single person in that room laughed. They saw a man past his prime, a washed-up soldier, a single father who had no business standing in a room full of elite security professionals half his age. What they didn't see, what none of them saw, was that Mason Rourke had already identified 6 security failures in the building before he'd finished signing his name at the front desk. And before the morning was over, he would end a fight in 7 seconds flat. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because this one goes places you won't see coming. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The application wasn't supposed to exist. Mason Rourke discovered it the same way he discovered most things that caught him off guard. Too late, when the wheels were already turning and there was nothing left to do but follow through. He'd been in the kitchen that Tuesday morning, standing at the stove with a cracked spatula in his hand, making scrambled eggs the way Hallie liked them. Slightly overcooked, with too much cheese and a little hot sauce on the side. His daughter sat at the kitchen table with her backpack already on, which meant she was either in a hurry or guilty of something. Turned out it was both. "You submitted what?" he said. Hallie, 9 years old and utterly fearless in the way only children raised by careful people can be, looked up from her cereal bowl with the expression of someone who had already rehearsed this conversation in her head and decided she was right. "Your application," she said. "To Whitmore Aeronautics for the security team." Mason turned the stove off. He set the spatula down on the counter slowly, because that was the kind of thing you did when you needed a second to collect yourself before you said something you couldn't take back. "Hallie, you've been looking for a job for 4 months, Dad. That's not—" He stopped, pressed his fingers against the counter. "How did you even know about that position?" "You left the tab open on the laptop." She shrugged. "It's a good job. Good pay. It fits what you know how to do. It's a job I didn't apply for." "Well, now you did." She said it with the kind of absolute certainty that reminded him of someone he used to be, and that made it worse somehow, the recognition. He looked at his daughter sitting there with her backpack on and her chin slightly lifted, daring him to be angry at her, and he couldn't hold on to the frustration. It slipped through his fingers like water. The truth was, she wasn't wrong. He'd been doing contract work for 18 months, warehouse security, overnight shifts at a parking facility downtown, one miserable 3-week stint doing personal protection for a minor league athlete who had treated him like a chauffeur. The bills were manageable. Barely. The savings account that had once represented something like a future had been thinning steadily since he'd left the Navy, and Mason Rourke was not a man who panicked, but he was also not a man who could ignore math. "I'll go to the interview," he said. "But we're talking about this when you get home." Hallie smiled and grabbed her cereal bowl. "You're going to get the job, Dad." He didn't answer that. Mutt. The Whitmore Aeronautics building sat in the northwest corner of the city like someone had dropped a glass box onto a street that hadn't expected it. 40 stories of tinted windows and architectural ambition, the kind of building that was designed to make you feel small before you walked through the door. Mason arrived 20 minutes early, which was a habit he hadn't been able to shake since his SEAL days. Early was on time was late. Late was something that got people killed. He stood outside for 30 seconds, looking at the entrance, noting the camera angles, the positioning of the door guards, the gap between the outer security checkpoint and the lobby desk. Then he went inside. The lobby was marble and high ceilings and the soft sound of recirculated air. A receptionist directed him to the 14th floor. When the elevator opened, he stepped into a waiting area that had been converted for the day into something resembling a holding pen. There were 12 other candidates. Mason registered them the way he'd been trained to register a room. Fast, systematic, without staring. Most of them were in their late 20s. Several were wearing tactical gear or slim-fit suits that had been chosen specifically to advertise their physiques. A few were going over documents on tablets. 2 were speaking quietly in the corner in the casual, familiar way of people who already knew each other. Nobody looked at Mason when he walked in. Then someone did. He was sitting near the window,
broad-shouldered, somewhere around 32, with a jaw like a brick, and the kind of posture that came from years of being told he was the best thing in every room he entered.
He was wearing a tailored charcoal jacket over a dark turtleneck, and he looked at Mason the way people look at something that's wandered into the wrong place. "You here for the maintenance team?" the man said. A few people laughed. Not many, but enough to establish the temperature of the room. Mason looked at him. Took his time about it. "No. Security position interviews in this room," the man said, like he was doing Mason a favor by clarifying. "I know." Another beat. The man's mouth curved slightly, the kind of smile that wasn't a smile. "I'm Brock Halstead. I run corporate security for the Morrow Group." He said the name like it was supposed to mean something. "You?" "Mason Rourke." Brock waited, the way people wait when they expect a resume to follow a name. Mason didn't offer one. He walked to the far side of the room and sat down in a chair near the wall. Not the nearest available seat, not the most comfortable one, but the one with a clear line of sight to both the door and the window. He sat there and waited. What? The interview process had been structured as a practical assessment rather than a standard sit-down. That information had been in the job posting, which Mason had read 3 times the night before, once to understand it, once to think about it, and once to memorize the details he might need. Candidates would be evaluated in a simulated environment, a recreation of Whitmore's executive floor, with paid actors in various roles, scripted threat scenarios, and a panel of evaluators watching from a second room through a 2-way window. Before the practical portion began, there was a brief orientation led by a man named Garrett, who worked in Whitmore's HR department and clearly would have preferred to be somewhere else. "Ms. Whitmore takes security seriously," Garrett said, reading from a paper he was holding. "The successful candidate will work directly with the Executive Protection Division and report to the security director. The role requires—" "What's the camera coverage on the 42nd floor stairwell?" Mason said. Garrett looked up. "Sorry?" "I noticed on the way up that the elevator bank on this floor has 4 cameras, but the stairwell door near the east exit only has 1, and it's positioned at an angle that leaves about a 6-foot blind spot just past the door frame. Is that intentional or a maintenance issue?" The room was quiet. Garrett blinked at him. That's not really part of what we're covering today." "Understood," Mason said, and he left it there. He didn't look at Brock Halstead, but he heard the shift in the room, the way the air changed when something unexpected happens, and nobody's sure how to categorize it yet. The practical assessment ran in rotation. Each candidate was given a scenario and evaluated on response time, threat identification, and what the panel called protective decision-making. Mason watched the first 4 candidates go through their scenarios from his chair in the waiting area. He wasn't watching them to judge them. He was watching to understand how the scenarios were structured, where the evaluators placed the actors, what cues they were using to signal threat escalation. By the 3rd candidate, he had figured out the pattern. When it was his turn, he walked into the simulation room and spent the first 45 seconds doing nothing but looking around. One of the evaluators visible through the glass shifted in his seat. The scenario unfolded: a fake press event, actors playing assistants and journalists, a planted threat who entered through the east corridor. Mason had identified the threat actor before he'd taken 3 steps into the room, based purely on the way the man was carrying his weight. Threat actors almost always leaned slightly forward. It was an unconscious preparation for movement. Most people never noticed it. Mason neutralized the scenario cleanly, relocated the executive to the room's safest corner, and then walked over to the evaluator's window and knocked on it. A pause. Then the door opened. "There's a second planted actor," Mason said. "The woman near the catering table. She's been moving in a 3-point pattern since I walked in. She's not eating, not talking to anyone, and she keeps checking the door. I didn't address it because the scenario didn't account for it, but you should know your secondary plan is visible." The lead evaluator, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a pen she kept clicking, looked at him for a long moment. "The second actor wasn't part of your scenario," she said. "No," Mason agreed, "but she was in the room." Brock Halstead's scenario went better than Mason expected. The man was genuinely capable, fast, decisive, physically imposing in a way that mattered. He cleared the room in under 40 seconds and handled the threat actor with the kind of controlled aggression that came from real training. When he walked back out, several of the other candidates applauded, and Brock absorbed it the way a man absorbs something he's always believed he deserved. The challenge came after. There was a break period. Coffee and water set out in the waiting area, candidates milling around, the ambient sound of professional small talk. Mason stood near the window with a paper cup of water he wasn't really drinking, watching the street 14 floors below. He was thinking about Hallie, about whether she'd eaten enough of her cereal before school, about the grocery list he'd left on the counter. "You did okay in there," Brock said. Mason turned. Brock was standing closer than necessary, the way certain men do when they're establishing territory through proximity. "Thanks," Mason said. "The thing about this kind of work," Brock continued, his voice carrying just enough to reach the people nearby, "is that it's not about what you used to be. You can't run a protection detail on past credentials. This isn't, no offense, whatever you were doing before." "None taken." Brock looked at him. "What were you doing before?" "Different work," Mason said. "Right." A small pause. "The thing is, protecting someone like Arabella Whitmore isn't a job for someone who's—" He tilted his head slightly, choosing his words with the deliberateness of someone who wants to be cruel without appearing to be. "In transition." "You're probably right," Mason said. That seemed to throw Brock slightly. He'd expected pushback or defensiveness, or the satisfying reaction of a man who felt diminished. Mason gave him none of those things. "Tell you what," Brock said, and now he was speaking to the room, the volume climbing just enough to collect an audience. "I've been doing this for 8 years, private security, executive protection, threat assessment. I've worked with former military before. Some of them are great. Some of them are," he shrugged, "better at following orders than making decisions." "That's a fair distinction," Mason said. "So here's what I'm saying." Brock set his coffee cup down. "If you genuinely think you belong in this room—" "I think I belong wherever the work is," Mason said. "I'm not here to compete with you. I'm here for the position." "Then let's make it interesting." Brock spread his hands. "Nothing that gets anyone actually hurt. Just demonstrate." It was the kind of invitation that only looks like an invitation. It was actually a corner. Mason looked at him for a moment. Then he set his water cup down on the window ledge. What happened next took 7 seconds. Mason didn't telegraph it, didn't assume a stance, didn't give any of the physical cues that trained fighters learn to read. He simply moved. Brock had enough experience to react. He brought his arm up, shifted his weight, started to close the distance between them. But Mason had already accounted for all of that. He used Brock's forward movement against him, redirected, applied pressure to exactly 2 points on Brock's arm in exactly the right sequence, and the larger man found himself facing the wall with his arm locked behind him before his brain had fully processed what was happening. Silence. Mason released him and stepped back. He picked up his water cup. Brock straightened slowly. His expression had changed. The performed confidence had cracked, not into anger, but into something more complicated. Something that might, eventually, become respect, though it hadn't gotten there yet. "That's what I used to do," Mason said quietly. It wasn't a boast. It was just an answer to the question Brock had been asking. Well, he was still thinking about leaving, running the math on whether he'd done enough to make the short list or whether he'd just torpedoed any chance he had by getting physical during a job interview. When the door on the far side of the waiting area opened and Arabella Whitmore walked in. He recognized her from the company's public materials, which he'd reviewed the night before. 30 years old, which always surprised people who expected someone that age to look uncertain in a position of that size. She didn't. She wore a dark blazer over a simple blouse. No visible jewelry except small earrings, her dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style. She moved through the room with the specific kind of self-possession that came not from arrogance, but from having made enough hard decisions that you'd stopped flinching. She was looking at Mason before she'd finished crossing the room. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Miss Whitmore." She studied him for a moment in that direct, unself-conscious way. "I watched the assessments from the observation room, including the last few minutes out here." Mason said nothing. "I want to have a conversation," she said. "Not in the formal debrief, just a conversation." She gestured toward a smaller room off the waiting area. "Do you have a few minutes?" He followed her in. She closed the door. The room was sparse. A table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out over the building's interior atrium. She didn't sit down immediately, which told him she was still deciding something. "How long did it take you to identify the gaps in our security?" she asked. "From the front entrance?" "Yes." "About 3 minutes," Mason said. "But I was being thorough. The most significant one, the stairwell on this floor, I flagged before the assessment started." Arabella nodded slowly. "Garrett mentioned that." She sat down. Mason sat across from her. "What else?" "The security team in the lobby changes posture when they recognize someone, which means an unfamiliar face gets more attention, but a known face gets less. That's a pattern someone patient could exploit." He paused. "The access badges on this floor use a rotating code system, but the reader on the east corridor door has a delay, about 1.5 seconds. Long enough for a second person to follow through without badging. It happens every day, probably. Nobody's counting it as a threat." Arabella was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You got all of that in a morning." "I wasn't trying to find problems," Mason said. "I was just watching." She was quiet for a moment. "You have a gap in your employment record." "Yes." 2 years. "Yes." "Your service file references an incident that resulted in a medical discharge." She didn't phrase it as a question, but it was one. "Yes," he said again. "I'm not going to ask you to detail it, but I need to know." She leaned forward slightly. "Is there anything in your background that would compromise your ability to protect someone?" Mason considered that, not because the answer was complicated, but because he wanted to give her an honest one rather than a convenient one. "No," he said, "but I want to tell you something before you make a decision." She waited. "Your security team is professional," Mason said. "Halstead is capable. The people watching you from that evaluation room know what they're doing, but the threat assessments they've been building are all oriented outward. They're looking for external actors." He paused. "The pattern of incidents against you over the last 8 months, the access anomalies, the information leaks the press has been reporting, those aren't coming from outside." Arabella went very still. "Someone inside your security infrastructure is watching you," Mason said, "not protecting you. Watching you and building something. I don't know what yet, but whatever they're building, they've been working on it for a while." The room was very quiet. Arabella Whitmore looked at him across the table, and for a moment, her composed expression slipped just enough for Mason to see what was underneath it. Not fear exactly, but the particular exhaustion of someone who has been suspicious of something for a long time and is waiting to find out whether their suspicion is paranoia or instinct. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I started suspecting 20 minutes after I got here," Mason said. "I'm more certain now." She looked at him for a long moment. "You don't have the right credentials for this position," she said. "Your record has a gap that 3 board members will object to. You have no corporate security experience. You showed up today in," she glanced briefly at his jacket, "clothes that suggest you didn't know whether you wanted this job or not." "My daughter submitted the application," Mason said. "I decided to show up." Something moved across Arabella Whitmore's face. It wasn't quite a smile. "Trial basis," she said. 30 days. You report directly to me, not to the security director." She stood up. "If in 30 days you haven't found anything, or if what you've found turns out to be nothing, we part professionally." Mason stood as well. "Understood." "And Mr. Rourke?" "Well," she looked at him directly. "If you're wrong about this, then you've got a bodyguard who's good at finding blind spots," he said. "That's not nothing." She held his gaze for another second. Then she nodded once and moved toward the door. Mason followed at a professional distance, already doing what he always did in a new environment. He was watching, counting exits, mapping the spaces between, and somewhere in the back of his mind he was noticing the way you notice something you can't identify yet but know you've seen before, that the security director hadn't come to observe any of the candidate assessments that morning. Not once. The first thing Mason did when he got home that evening was make dinner. Not because he was hungry, but because Hallie was, and because the act of standing at the stove with something to focus on helped him think. He made pasta with jarred marinara and ground turkey,
the kind of meal that required just enough attention to keep his hands busy while his mind ran through everything he'd seen at Whitmore Aeronautics. The security camera angles, the badge reader delay, the access log patterns he'd been allowed to briefly review before leaving the building, and the thing that sat underneath all of it like a stone at the bottom of a shallow river, the fact that Corbin Vale, Whitmore's head of security, had been absent from an entire day of candidate evaluations for a position that reported directly to his division. "You got the job," Callie said from the kitchen table. She wasn't asking. "Trial basis," Mason said. 30 days. "That's the job." He looked over his shoulder at her. She was doing homework. Math, by the looks of it, the kind with fractions that she'd been complaining about for 2 weeks.
She had her pencil tucked behind her ear the same way her mother used to. Mason turned back to the stove. "Don't do it again," he said. "The application thing, I need you to ask me before you do something like that." "You would have said no." "Probably." "So." He turned the burner down, stirred the sauce. "Hallie." "Dad." She said it back in the exact same tone, and he had the very specific experience of being outmaneuvered by a 9-year-old. He let it go. Some battles chose their timing, and this one could wait. What couldn't wait was the work. He sat down after dinner with his laptop and the sparse file Arabella's assistant had forwarded to him before he'd left the building. A summary of security incidents over the previous 8 months, the kind of sanitized overview that HR prepared for new hires, all the sharp edges sanded down. It was almost useless as actual intelligence, but it told him one thing clearly. Whoever had compiled it had been very careful about what to leave out. The gaps in the incident log were more informative than what was there. He worked until midnight. Hallie had been asleep for 2 hours by then, and the apartment was quiet in the particular way of places that hold only 2 people, where the silence has a texture to it. Mason closed the laptop, rubbed his face with both hands, and sat in the dark for a while. He thought about a man named Daniel Cho, who had been his teammate and his closest friend for 6 years, and who had been dead for 11. He didn't think about Daniel often. He'd learned over time how to store that particular weight in a place where it didn't interfere with the daily mechanics of living. But tonight something had snagged on it, some detail from the day that he couldn't yet identify, and the memory had surfaced the way old things do, quietly, without permission. He went to bed. He didn't sleep well. He hadn't slept well in 11 years. His first week at Whitmore Aeronautics was quiet, in a way that should have been reassuring and wasn't. Arabella had introduced him to the executive floor team as a security consultant brought in for a parallel assessment, which was vague enough to be true and specific enough to explain his presence without triggering questions. He shadowed the existing protection detail, reviewed access logs, attended briefings, and spent a considerable amount of time doing what he did best, being present in rooms without being noticed. The existing team was professional in the surface way of people who had been doing their jobs long enough to become efficient without remaining alert. They checked the boxes. They ran the protocols. They'd stopped actually looking at things about 3 years ago, from what Mason could tell. It wasn't laziness exactly. It was the particular blindness that came from familiarity, the way you stopped seeing the furniture in a room you lived in every day. Brock Halstead was the exception. He was still visibly adjusting to Mason's presence, which made sense. A man like Brock organized his sense of professional identity around being the most capable person in any given security situation, and Mason's appearance in that waiting room, and what had happened in the last few minutes before the assessment ended, had introduced a variable Brock hadn't accounted for. He wasn't hostile exactly, but he watched Mason with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether a new piece on the board was a threat or an asset. Mason let him watch. It cost him nothing. What cost him something was the tracking device. He found it on a Wednesday, 11 days into the trial period, in the rear wheel well of Arabella's company vehicle, a black SUV that was swept for devices on a monthly schedule. The device was small, commercial grade, the kind of thing available through a dozen different vendors, and it had been placed in a position specifically chosen to survive a standard sweep. Whoever put it there knew the sweep protocol. Mason photographed it in place, documented the exact position, and then stood up from the parking garage floor and stood very still for about 30 seconds. He didn't remove it, not yet. Instead, he went back upstairs, found a quiet corner of the executive floor, and spent 2 hours reconstructing the vehicle's movement history for the previous 6 weeks against the incident log. The pattern that emerged was not subtle once you knew to look for it. 3 of the incidents, a near miss at an outdoor event, an unauthorized access attempt at a storage facility, and a press leak about Arabella's schedule, had all occurred within 48 hours of the vehicle traveling to locations that weren't on the official calendar. Private meetings, the kind that didn't go through the scheduling assistant. Someone had been using the tracking data to find the gaps, the moments when Arabella was between official protocol and official record. Mason went to find her. No. She was in a glass-walled conference room on the 38th floor, sitting across from 2 men in suits who had the tightly controlled expressions of lawyers delivering information nobody wanted to hear. Her assistant, a young woman named Petra, who moved through the building at a near-constant low-level panic, intercepted him at the door. "Ms. Whitmore is in a meeting." "I know," Mason said. "I need 5 minutes." She specifically asked not to be Petra. He looked at her. 5 minutes. Tell her it's about the vehicle. Petra looked uncertain in the way of someone balancing competing anxieties, then knocked softly on the conference room glass. Arabella glanced up, read something in Petra's expression, and excused herself. She came to the door and stepped out, pulling it mostly shut behind her. Up close, in the flat light of the hallway, she looked like she hadn't been sleeping much. There were faint lines around her eyes that hadn't been visible during their first meeting, and the set of her mouth was the particular tightness of someone managing too many things at once. "What is it?" she said quietly. "Your car has a tracker. It's been there at least 6 weeks, positioned to survive your standard sweep. Whoever placed it knows your security protocols." She didn't react the way most people did. There was no gasp, no visible flinching. She absorbed it the way she seemed to absorb most unwelcome information, with a stillness that might look like calm to someone who didn't notice that her hand had tightened slightly on the door frame. "You didn't remove it," she said. "No." "Why?" "Because if I remove it, whoever's monitoring it knows we found it. Right now, they don't know that. That's worth more than removing it." She looked at him. "What do you need from me?" "A list of every location that vehicle traveled to in the last 2 months that wasn't on the official schedule. Wherever you went that you didn't tell your assistant about beforehand." A pause. Something crossed her face, not reluctance exactly, but the specific discomfort of someone being asked to account for the private architecture of their own life. "That's a short list," she said finally. "Then it won't take long." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "Come to my office at 6, after the building thins out." He nodded. She went back into the conference room. Mason walked back to the elevator, and on the way he passed the door to Corbin Vale's office, which was closed, as it usually was. Through the frosted glass panel beside the door, he could see the shape of someone at a desk, the blurred outline of a person working. He kept walking, but he made a note of the time. Arabella's office at 6 o'clock was quieter than Mason expected. The executive floor had emptied out, and the cleaning crew hadn't started yet, so the space had that in-between quality of a place that belongs to no one for an hour. She was standing at her window when he came in, looking out at the city the way people do when they're trying to organize their thoughts spatially. She gave him 4 locations: a law firm in the south end of the city, where she'd had 2 meetings with an attorney who was not on retainer with Whitmore Aeronautics, a private airfield twice, a restaurant in the East Quarter that she'd described simply as personal. Mason wrote them down. The law firm. What were the meetings about? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. A potential restructuring of my shareholder agreement. It's not something the board knows about yet. And the airfield? I've been considering acquiring a smaller firm. Early conversations. Nothing documented. Acquisitions that the board doesn't know about yet, Mason said. Preliminary conversations aren't required disclosures. I understand that, he said. I'm not questioning your decisions. I'm trying to understand what information someone would want and why they'd want it before the board's next major meeting. Arabella turned from the window. What are you saying? I'm saying whoever's been tracking your vehicle isn't interested in hurting you physically. They're interested in information, specifically information that would give someone an advantage before a major corporate decision. He paused. When is the next board meeting? 6 weeks? And is there a vote on the agenda that has significant implications for the company's direction? She looked at him steadily. There's a vote on the primary investor position for the Meridian drone project. It's worth approximately $300 million to whatever entity secures the contract. And your vote? I hold a controlling voice on the initial recommendation. Mason sat back in the chair. The pieces were arranging themselves in the way he recognized from a different kind of work. Not the jagged chaos of an external threat, but the slow, patient geometry of an inside operation. Someone had been building this for months, maybe longer. Who knows the full scope of the Meridian project, he asked. Board members, senior engineering staff. My security director reviews all executive briefings. There it was again. He let it sit. Ms. Whitmore, he said carefully, I want to look at your security director's access logs, everything he's requested in the last year. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. That's a significant accusation. I'm not making an accusation. I'm asking to look at data. Corbin Vale has been with this company for 7 years. He was hired by my father. I understand. You understand, she repeated, and there was an edge in it. Not anger exactly, but the particular friction of someone being pushed toward a conclusion they've already considered and didn't like. She crossed her arms. You've been here 11 days, Mason. It was the first time she'd used his first name. He didn't point it out. 11 days, he agreed. And I found a tracking device your team missed for 6 weeks. I'm not telling you who to trust. I'm telling you what the evidence is pointing at and asking permission to look at more of it. Silence. Outside the window, the city was doing what cities did at this hour, going orange at the edges, filling up with the particular noise of a day ending. I'll have Petra get you secure access to the internal system by tomorrow morning, Arabella said. Everything in Corbin's division. Full access. Thank you. Don't thank me. She turned back to the window. If you're wrong about this, it's going to be a very uncomfortable situation. And if I'm right? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than it had been. Then I've been sitting 10 feet from the problem every day for a year and didn't see it. Mason stood to leave. Mason. She said it without turning around. The restaurant I listed, the personal one, that doesn't go into any report. It's not relevant to the investigation, he said. So it won't. He left. In the hallway, he paused for just a moment outside Corbin Vale's dark office. Empty now, door still closed, the frosted glass panel black. He walked to the elevator. He had work to do. Mutt. The access logs took him 3 days to get through properly. Not because they were voluminous, though they were, but because whoever had been managing them had been careful. The kind of careful that looks like tidiness. Records that were complete on the surface, properly time-stamped, nothing obviously missing. But Mason had spent years reading intelligence reports where the important information lived in the negative space. What wasn't reported, what was filed but never acted on, what was acknowledged and then quietly buried. He found the pattern on the 3rd day at 2 a.m, sitting in the small security monitoring room he'd been given access to on the 14th floor. The confidential briefings for the Meridian project had been accessed 41 times over 11 months through Corbin Vale's security credentials. On 22 of those occasions, the access had occurred outside of standard business hours, evenings, a few weekend mornings, twice after midnight. What made it significant wasn't the frequency. It was the timing. Every access event was followed within 72 hours by something else. A press inquiry about Arabella's leadership, a complaint filed with the board by a minor shareholder, an anonymous tip to a financial news outlet, a scheduling conflict that had forced Arabella into an unprotected public appearance. 41 accesses, 22 after hours, 17 subsequent incidents. Not every access produced an incident, but every incident had been preceded by an access. Mason stared at the screen for a long time. Then he opened a separate window and pulled up Corbin Vale's personnel file, the internal one, not the sanitized HR version. He read through it slowly, The way he read things when he wasn't looking for anything specific, but wanted to be sure he wasn't missing something obvious. He got to the section on previous employment and stopped. Vale had worked for a private security consulting firm before joining Whitmore Aeronautics. The firm was listed as Ashgate Strategic, and it had operated primarily on federal contracts, Department of Defense work, some international consulting. Mason stared at the name for a long time. He had heard of Ashgate Strategic. Not recently. A long time ago. In a different context, in a different part of his life, in a briefing that had preceded the worst night of his career. Ashgate Strategic had been named, informally, never officially, in the investigation that followed the mission that killed Daniel Cho. The investigation that had gone nowhere, that had been quietly closed, that had ended with a medical discharge and a sealed record and 11 years of Mason Rourke carrying a weight he couldn't set down. He sat in the monitoring room with the screen light on his face and the building quiet around him, and something moved inside his chest. Not quite anger, not quite recognition. Something older than both of those things. He thought about Daniel again, about the way the mission had unraveled in ways that couldn't have been accidental, about the intelligence that had turned out to be wrong in exactly the right ways to cause maximum damage, about the internal inquiry that had identified Mason as the responsible party and closed the file before anyone had finished asking questions. Someone had fed that operation bad information, someone with access to the mission parameters and the security protocols, someone who knew how to make records look clean. He minimized the file, opened a new document, started writing down what he had, in the order he had it, without conclusions, just evidence, sequenced and dated. He worked for another 2 hours. When he was done, he had 6 pages of documented observations that he was fairly certain would be enough to open a formal investigation. He also had something else, something that wasn't evidence yet, that lived in the space between pattern recognition and paranoia. A suspicion with no documentation that he would not write down and would not share until he had something solid. The idea that the man who had let Daniel Cho die had found his way into Whitmore Aeronautics and had been sitting 40 feet from Mason Rourke for 11 days. He called Hallie from the parking garage at 4:30 in the morning, knowing she wouldn't pick up, listening to her voicemail message. Her voice still had that slightly formal quality she used when she was trying to sound older, telling callers to leave a message and that she'd get back to them soon. He listened to it twice. Didn't leave a message himself, just needed to hear her voice for a minute. He drove home through empty streets, changed clothes, made coffee, left for Whitmore before Hallie woke up, leaving a note on the kitchen table next to her backpack. Eggs in the fridge, money on the counter for lunch. See you at dinner. He'd been leaving notes like this for so long that they'd become a language of their own, a shorthand between them that communicated things neither of them put into words. I was here. I'll be back. You're not alone. He was almost out the door when he heard her moving around in her room. He waited. She appeared in the hallway in pajamas, hair going in 3 different directions, looking at him with the half-awake expression of someone who had something to say. You were up late, she said. Yeah. Bad late or work late? He looked at his daughter. Work late. She nodded slowly, in the way she did when she was deciding whether to push further. She decided not to. Okay, she said. Be careful. Always. You're not always careful. I'm always careful enough. She gave him the look, the one that was too old for her face and had been since she was about 6, the one that said she knew more about him than he'd ever told her, because children who grow up around quiet people learn to read what isn't said. Then she disappeared back into her room, and he heard the sound of a drawer opening. He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he left. The door closed behind him. He sat in his car for a few seconds before starting it, and the morning was very still, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking at nothing. He started the car, pulled out, drove toward a building where someone had been watching a woman who didn't know she was being watched, where bad intelligence had the same careful fingerprints as bad intelligence he'd seen before, where a name from 11 years ago had surfaced in a personnel file at 4 in the morning. He drove toward it steadily. Because that was the thing about Mason Rourke. He had long since stopped running from things, and he had never been particularly good at waiting. He drove toward it because the work was there, and the work was what he had, and right now the work and the truth were pointing in the same direction. That was enough to move on. The Whitmore Aeronautics Annual Innovation Gala was held on the 22nd day of Mason's trial period, which meant he had 8 days left to either prove what he suspected or accept that he was building a case out of coincidences and old ghosts. He'd spent the previous week moving carefully, not showing his hand, reviewing logs during off hours, cross-referencing access records against the incident timeline he'd built, asking small questions in casual conversation that nobody would remember asking. He'd learned a long time ago that the most effective investigations looked like nothing from the outside. The moment someone knew you were looking, they started managing what you could see. He still hadn't told Arabella about Ashgate Strategic. Not yet. The connection was real. He was certain of it. But certainty wasn't evidence, and he needed evidence before he put that particular piece on the table. What he had so far was a paper trail that pointed clearly at Corbin Vale's credentials being used to access confidential documents at irregular hours. What he didn't have yet was proof that Vale himself was behind it, rather than someone using his credentials without his knowledge. That distinction mattered. It was the difference between a bad actor and a patsy. The gala was held in Whitmore's main atrium, a space that spanned the building's first 3 floors and had been designed for exactly this kind of event, all glass ceiling and open architecture and the kind of dramatic vertical space that made people feel like they'd walked into something important. By 7 o'clock, there were close to 200 guests, investors, aerospace industry contacts, board members, a handful of journalists who'd been carefully vetted and given access. The catering was understated in the expensive way, the kind of food that came in small portions and had long names. Mason arrived an hour before the guests and walked the entire space twice. He identified 11 positions that a professional would choose for surveillance. He noted the locations of every emergency exit, every service corridor, every door that could be locked from inside. He spoke briefly with the event security team, a contracted firm that Whitmore used for public events, and asked 3 questions that told him everything he needed to know about their preparation level. They were competent for crowd management. They were not equipped for a targeted threat. He radioed Arabella's personal detail, 2 of the existing Whitmore security team, men named Soren and Taft, who had warmed to Mason grudgingly over the past 3 weeks after recognizing that he wasn't there to displace them, but to work alongside them. "Stay visual on her the entire evening," he told them. "No bathroom breaks without coverage. If her location changes, I want to know before she moves." Soren, who was 31 and had a dry sense of humor he kept mostly to himself, said, "You expecting something tonight?" "I'm always expecting something," Mason said. "Tonight I'm expecting it more than usual." He positioned himself near the eastern edge of the atrium, where a slight elevation change in the flooring gave him a marginally better sightline across the room. He had a glass of water he wasn't drinking. He was wearing a dark suit that fit well enough, borrowed from a dry cleaner that did alterations because Arabella's assistant had told him 3 days ago, with professional diplomacy, that his usual attire would not be appropriate for a gala and that Whitmore would cover the cost. He'd kept the old shoes. The evening moved the way these events always did. The initial gathering, the milling and networking, the gradual loosening that came with a second glass of wine. Arabella worked the room with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up watching her father do it, moving from conversation to conversation, remembering names, asking the right questions, laughing at the right moments. She was good at it. Mason watched her and thought that most people in the room saw exactly what she was performing and thought it was effortless and had no idea what it cost. He watched her and also watched everything else. Corbin Vale arrived at 7:45. He was a trim man, mid-50s, silver at the temples, with the kind of face that seemed designed for professional contexts. Not distinctive enough to be memorable, not plain enough to be invisible. He wore his authority lightly, the way people do when they've had it long enough that they've stopped thinking about it. He worked the room as well, though differently than Arabella. Slower, more purposeful, stopping to speak at length with board members and senior staff. Mason watched him from across the atrium and noted the conversations, the body language, the way Vale's eyes moved across the room at regular intervals. He was doing the same thing Mason was doing, watching. At 8:15, Mason's radio earpiece clicked twice, Soren's signal for movement. Arabella was heading toward the northeast corridor,
where the restrooms and a smaller hospitality room were located. Mason was already moving before the second click faded, cutting through the crowd at the speed that was just below the threshold where people notice you're moving with purpose. He reached the corridor junction 30 seconds after Arabella entered it. Something was wrong. He felt it before he could articulate it, the specific texture of a space that had been altered. The corridor was properly lit. There was nothing visually out of place, but the 2 event security staff who had been posted at the junction when he'd walked it an hour ago were gone, and in their place was nothing, just the corridor and the sound of the gala behind him. He kept moving, reached the T-junction and turned left toward the hospitality room. The door was open. A woman he didn't recognize, dark jacket, the specific careful neutral of someone trying not to be noticed, was coming out of it, and she looked at Mason for just a fraction of a second too long before looking away and turning toward the main atrium. He let her go, filed the face, kept moving. Arabella was 20 feet ahead talking to a board member named Hartwell, a man in his 60s who seemed to be making a point about something that required more hand gestures than the point probably warranted. She was listening with the patient attention of someone who had been listening to Hartwell make points for a long time. She looked over Hartwell's shoulder and saw Mason. Something in her expression shifted. Not alarm, but a readiness. He gave her a small nod. "Stay where you are." She understood it. She returned her attention to Hartwell and steered them both with the elegant inevitability of someone who had been managing human traffic all evening toward the interior wall rather than the corridor junction. Mason walked past them to the service door at the end of the corridor. He pushed it open and stood in the doorway. The service corridor beyond was a concrete-floored working space, catering staging area on the left, a freight elevator, a row of equipment lockers on the right. 2 catering staff were visible near the staging area, but they were too far in the wrong direction to be relevant. What was relevant was the freight elevator, which was on this floor but had recently been used. The indicator light above the door showed it returning from the lobby level, and there was a faint, sharp smell in the air near the elevator that Mason identified after a moment as a specific type of accelerant used in certain emergency smoke devices. Not fire, not a real emergency, a fake one. He understood immediately. Someone had positioned a smoke device in or near the freight elevator, calibrated to deploy in a way that would trigger the building's air quality sensors without setting off the full fire alarm. The result would be a partial emergency alert, enough to create controlled chaos, enough to move people towards specific exits, enough to funnel Arabella Whitmore out of the building through a predictable route at a predictable time, into whatever was waiting outside. He turned around, went back to Arabella. "We need to move," he said, low and direct, stepping into the conversation with Hartwell in a way that left no room for objection. "Not toward the main exit." Arabella looked at him. "What? Now?" "I'm sorry, Harold." He placed a hand lightly at Arabella's elbow, not gripping, just present, and moved her toward the interior of the building, away from the corridor, back into the main atrium. 20 seconds later, the building's air quality alert system produced a tone. Not the full alarm, exactly as he'd anticipated, but a soft, persistent pulse that immediately changed the texture of the room. The event security team began moving guests toward the main atrium exits. Voices rose. Someone near the bar asked loudly what was happening. The controlled chaos bloomed exactly on schedule. Soren appeared at Mason's left shoulder. "What's going on?" "Manufactured," Mason said. "Someone wanted to push her toward the north exit." "Soren, get the car to the south garage. Not the usual position. Taft, stay on her right side." He looked at Arabella. "We're going out through the maintenance level. Do you trust me?" She looked at him for one full second. "Yes," she said, simply. They moved. Back. Afterward, in the underground parking structure, with the building's muted emergency tone still audible from above, Arabella sat in the back seat of the SUV with her arms crossed and the particular stillness of someone processing too many things at once. Soren was in the driver's seat. Taft was outside the vehicle, watching the garage entrance. Mason sat in the front passenger seat and gave her 2 minutes before he said anything. "Someone inside had access to the building's air quality system," he said. "That's not a public access point. That's an internal infrastructure login." "Corbin's division manages building systems," Arabella said. Her voice was level.
I know what you're going to say. I'm not saying it yet. I need you to know what I found this week first, he told her. The access log analysis. The 17 incidents that had each followed within 72 hours of an after-hours credential use. The pattern that was too consistent to be coincidence and too careful to be accidental. He told her all of it in the measured, sequential way he'd learned to present intelligence. No editorializing, just the evidence laid out in order. When he finished, Arabella was quiet for a long time. You think Corbin's credentials are being used to access the Meridian files, she said. But you're not certain it's him personally. That's right. It could be someone who has access to his credentials. It's possible, I haven't ruled it out. She turned to look out the window at the concrete pillars of the parking structure. When I was 19, she said, Corbin Vale sat in my father's hospital room with us. He drove me home the night my father had his first cardiac event. He's been in this company longer than most of the board members. She paused. I'm not telling you that to defend him. I'm telling you that because you need to understand what it means if you're right. I know, Mason said. No. She turned back to him. You know it professionally. I'm telling you personally. She held his gaze. Don't bring me something incomplete. If you're going to do this, bring me everything, because the moment I move on Corbin Vale, there is no taking it back. Understood, Mason said. She nodded once, looked away again. The photographs appeared 4 days later. Mason saw them the same way everyone else did, through a financial news outlet that ran them without much preamble, under a headline about questions of professional conduct at Whitmore Aeronautics. There were 3 images. The first showed Mason and Arabella in the northeast corridor during the gala, his hand at her elbow, her face turned toward his in a way that looked, without context, intimate. The second was from an earlier date. Mason couldn't immediately place it, though he recognized the location as the 38th floor corridor, and showed the two of them talking in what appeared to be a private conversation. Arabella's body language tilted slightly toward him in the way that cameras made mundane things look significant. The third was taken from outside the building, through a window, showing them in her office at what was clearly after hours, sitting across from each other at her desk. The accompanying article was careful. It didn't make direct accusations. It used phrases like questions of judgment and the appropriateness of the relationship between Ms. Whitmore and her security consultant, and sources within the company who expressed concern. It was the kind of journalism that didn't need to say anything explicitly because the images said it implicitly, and implication was enough. Mason read it once. Then he called Hallie's school to make sure she was there and that nobody had approached her. She was. Nobody had. He went to find Arabella. She was already in a meeting with her communications director and her legal counsel when he arrived on the 38th floor. Petra intercepted him with the apologetic urgency she deployed when things were bad. She's going to be in there for a while. Tell her I know how they got the images, Mason said. Petra went in, came back out 30 seconds later and held the door open. The communications director, a woman named Sylvie who wore her stress visibly, in the tight set of her shoulders and the pen she kept clicking without realizing it, looked at Mason when he entered with the expression of someone assigning blame. The legal counsel, a man Mason had seen twice before and whose name he couldn't remember, looked at him with the more neutral expression of a man who assigned everything to categories. Arabella said, "Close the door." He closed it. "Tell me," she said. "The service corridor at the gala has 2 cameras. Both of them are on the internal security network." He looked at her steadily. "The image of us in the corridor was pulled from the security feed, not taken by a photographer. Someone with access to the internal camera network extracted the frame and sent it to an outside party." He paused. "The image of your office was taken from the building across the street. There's a sight line from the east-facing offices on the 22nd floor of the Carver building, directly into your office if your blinds aren't fully closed." Arabella looked at him without expression. "And the third image, the corridor on this floor, that was also pulled from internal security footage." He paused. "All 3 sources trace back to the same access point." Sylvie said, "Which is?" "The security director's administrative login," Mason said. He kept his eyes on Arabella when he said it. The room was very quiet. "That's, Sylvie started. "I know what it is," Arabella said.
Shivi had gone very still in the way Mason had learned meant she was working through something rather than reacting to it. Sylvie, I need 15 minutes. Arabella, the board is already 15 minutes, she said, with the specific tone that ended discussions. Sylvie and the legal counsel gathered their things and left. The door closed. Arabella stood up from the table and walked to the window. Mason waited. The board called an emergency session for Friday, she said. They want to discuss my fitness to lead given the questions that have been raised.
That's the point, Mason said. The gala was supposed to put you in a compromised position physically, somewhere you could be reached or documented in a way that created a problem. When that didn't work, whoever's running this pivoted to using the images instead. The goal is the same. The board meeting is the deadline. The Meridian contract vote, she said. Yes. She turned from the window. I need you to understand something. The board already has members who want to move in a different direction. They have for 2 years. This, she gestured at nothing specific, meaning all of it, gives them the narrative they need to justify removing me as CEO before the vote. I know. And the simplest way to manage this from a damage control standpoint, she stopped, is to remove me, Mason said. I know that too. She looked at him. You're a liability right now. As long as you're visible, the story is about your presence. If I step back, whoever's running this achieves exactly what they've been working toward for months, Mason said. They get me out of the building, they remove the only person who's found the pattern, and you walk into a board meeting on Friday without anyone in your corner who knows where the evidence is. He kept his voice even. Removing me right now is not damage control. It's exactly what they want. Arabella held his gaze for a long moment. He could see her turning it over, the calculation, the competing risks, the weight of a decision that had no clean answer. If I keep you here, she said, the story gets worse before it gets better. Yes. And if I let you go, then it gets better on the surface, Mason said, for about 4 days, until Friday. Another silence. Outside, the city was doing its mid-morning thing. Deliveries, traffic, the sound of a building being cleaned somewhere nearby. What do you need? She said finally. He exhaled slowly. Access to Corbin Vale's personnel file. The full one, not the internal version. I need the original hiring documents and the background check that was done when he joined the company. She frowned slightly. Why the original background check? Because I think it was modified, Mason said. And I think whoever modified it did it well, but not perfectly. And I think there's something in his pre-Whitmore employment history that connects to... He stopped. She waited. To something that happened to me a long time ago, he said. Arabella studied him. It was the particular study of someone deciding how much they needed to understand versus how much they needed to trust. I'll get you the file, she said. He had the file by noon. He read it in the security monitoring room with the door locked, taking his time, going through it in the same methodical way he approached every document, sequentially, without jumping ahead, without letting what he expected to find shape what he actually saw. The original background check had been conducted by an external firm, as was standard for senior hires. The firm was named, the date was noted, the findings summary was attached. Standard format. Clean language. Nothing that would catch the eye of anyone who wasn't looking for something specific. Mason was looking for something specific. He found it on page 7 of the pre-employment history section. A 14-month employment gap in Corbin Vale's record from 11 and a half years ago to 10 years ago. The gap was explained in the document with a single line: independent consulting, private sector. No firm name, no clients listed, no reference contact provided. The background check firm had flagged it. Their note, buried in the appendix, read, "Subject declined to provide verifiable references for this period. Gap is within acceptable parameters for senior hire. Recommend internal discretion." And then, beneath that note, in slightly different formatting that suggested it had been added after the original document was generated, reviewed and cleared, CV Corbin Vale. His own initials, on a background check that was supposed to be an independent review of his own history. Mason sat back in his chair. The 14-month gap aligned exactly with the period surrounding the mission that had killed Daniel Cho. The period during which someone had fed Mason's SEAL team compromised intelligence. The period during which Ashgate Strategic, listed in Vale's previous employment history, had been operating on overlapping federal contracts. He had been careful, all week, not to let this become personal. He had kept the professional distance he'd learned to maintain because personal investment compromised judgment, and compromised judgment got people killed. He had done that carefully and consistently. He allowed himself in that locked room alone 60 seconds to feel the full weight of what he was looking at. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person from his Navy days he still had a number for. A woman named Reyes who worked in federal contracting oversight and owed him a favor she'd been carrying for 8 years. He left a voicemail. He kept it short. He asked for any documented connection between Ashgate Strategic and a defense intelligence operation from 11 years ago, and he gave her a case reference number he had memorized so long ago that it had become part of the furniture of his memory. He hung up, sat for another moment. Then he thought about Brock Halstead. It had been nagging at him for 3 days. The photographs, the credential use, the pattern. Something about the framing of it felt wrong in a way he hadn't been able to articulate. He'd been so focused on Vale that he hadn't stopped to examine the structure from the other direction. Who benefited from Vale's credentials being used rather than someone else's? Why use the security director's login rather than creating a ghost account or using a compromised mid-level user? The answer, if you were building something that needed to hold up for a while, was that the security director's credentials carried inherent legitimacy. But the answer, if something went wrong, was that the security director was the obvious suspect. And the obvious suspect was also the obvious scapegoat. He pulled up Brock Halstead's profile in the internal system. Brock's corporate access card had been reported lost 6 weeks ago. Replacement issued. The report was in the system, properly filed, time-stamped. Standard procedure. Nothing suspicious about it on its face. But the card reported lost was a secondary card, an override-level access credential that Halstead had been issued when he was temporarily assigned to cover a gap in senior security coverage 3 months ago. The kind of card that carried elevated permissions. The kind that, if it had been cloned rather than lost, could be used to piggyback on another user's login signature. The kind that, if someone were building a frame, would connect the evidence to 2 people instead of 1, Vale's identity on the access logs, Halstead's physical credential as the mechanism. Mason stared at the screen. Brock Halstead hadn't stolen anything. His card had been taken from him, cloned, and then reported lost to cover the use. The access logs showing Vale's credentials were real, but they were being generated through Halstead's cloned card as a relay, which meant the authentication trail would point at Vale while the physical access pointed at Halstead, and between the two of them, whoever was actually running the operation stayed invisible. It was clean work, genuinely clean, the kind of thing that required both technical access and a thorough understanding of how a corporate security investigation would proceed, which entry points an investigator would check first, which logs would be pulled, which personnel would be scrutinized. The kind of knowledge a security director would have, not Vale as the operator, Vale as the architect, using Halstead as the instrument and his own credentials as the surface evidence, structured so that when the investigation began, it would consume both of them while the real purpose, removing Arabella before Friday's board meeting, was accomplished. Mason picked up his phone. He needed to talk to Brock Halstead, not as a rival, not as a colleague, as someone who had been set up and probably didn't know it yet. He also needed to do it without Corbin Vale finding out. He typed a text to Brock's personal number, which he'd memorized from the personnel files weeks ago, the way he memorized most things, automatically, without deciding to. Need to talk. Off-site. Tonight. This is Mason Rourke. Don't tell anyone I reached out. He sent it, pocketed the phone, stood up, unlocked the door, walked out into the corridor where the building continued its ordinary Tuesday afternoon business around him. Phones ringing somewhere, the distant sound of a meeting in progress, a cart of mail being wheeled toward the elevator bank. He walked past Corbin Vale's office. The door was open today, which was unusual. Vale was at his desk, on the phone, turned slightly away from the door. As Mason passed, Vale glanced up briefly. made eye contact for half a second, then returned to his call. It was nothing. It was the kind of glance that happened 50 times a day in a busy building. Mason kept walking, maintained his pace, kept his expression exactly as it needed to be. Neutral, unhurried, a man on his way somewhere unremarkable. But in that half second of eye contact, he had seen something he recognized from a specific and terrible night 11 years ago. He didn't know yet how to prove it. He didn't know yet how to put it on paper in a way that would mean anything to anyone else. What he knew was this: the man on the phone in that office was not a man who had been using a position of trust for personal gain. He was something more deliberate than that, something that had been in motion for longer than anyone at Whitmore Aeronautics understood. And Mason Rourke, who had spent 11 years carrying the weight of a night he couldn't fully explain, was now standing close enough to the truth that he could almost touch it. He turned the corner. He kept moving. Brock Halstead picked the meeting location, a bar called Fenwick's in the East Quarter, the kind of place that had been there long enough to stop trying to be anything other than what it was. Dark wood, low lighting, a jukebox in the corner that someone had unplugged sometime in the previous decade, and nobody had bothered to plug back in. Brock was already there when Mason arrived, sitting in a booth near the back with a beer he hadn't touched, and the expression of a man who had been doing uncomfortable math all afternoon. Mason slid into the booth across from him, didn't order anything. Brock looked at him. "You said don't tell anyone. That mean I'm in trouble, or you are?" "Probably both," Mason said. "But yours isn't your fault." Brock's jaw tightened. "Explain that." Mason put his phone on the table, face up, with a screenshot of the access log analysis he'd built over the past 2 weeks. He let Brock look at it without narrating it, because the kind of man Brock was needed to arrive at the conclusion himself, or he'd spend the next 20 minutes arguing with it. Brock read it. His expression moved through several things: confusion, then a focused frown, then the particular stillness of someone who has understood something and doesn't like what it means. "My override card," he said. "The one I reported lost." "When did you actually lose it?" Brock looked up. "I didn't lose it. I thought I did. It wasn't in my desk one morning, but when I went to file the replacement report, Corbin told me to handle the paperwork myself rather than going through the standard process." He paused. "He said it was faster." "Did that seem unusual?" "A little, but Corbin's always had his way of doing things. He's been here long enough that people don't question his process." Brock set the phone down. "So he took my card. Or someone he directed took it. Either way, someone cloned it before you reported it missing, and the clone has been used as the physical relay for accessing Vail's administrative login remotely. It lets someone generate access events that look like Vail's credentials from a physical location consistent with Vail's movements, while keeping the actual operator off the log entirely." Brock was quiet for a moment. "And the access logs point at Vail?" "Yes. And the cloned card points at me." "To anyone doing a surface investigation?" "Yes. The structure is designed to burn through 2 people before it gets anywhere near whoever's actually running it." Brock sat back. He picked up his beer, considered it, put it down again. "So I've been carrying the instrument of my own frame job around in my desk for 3 months and didn't know it." "You couldn't have known," Mason said. "It was specifically designed to look like a routine credential incident." Brock looked at him for a long moment. "Why are you telling me this? You could have just let me take the fall. Would have made things cleaner for you." Mason looked back at him. "You didn't do anything wrong." It was a simple answer. It seemed to land harder than Brock expected. He looked away briefly. At the bar, at the dark jukebox, at nothing specific. And when he looked back, there was something different in his expression. Not softness exactly. More like the recalibration of a man who has been using one set of measurements and discovered they were off. "What do you need from me?" Brock said. "Everything you remember about how Corbin Vail operates. Not the official version, what you actually observed. Decisions that seemed odd. Access requests that didn't quite fit. Anything he asked you to handle that you later thought about twice." Brock nodded slowly. He started talking. "That's it. They were at Fenwick's for 2.5 hours. Mason listened more than he spoke, the way he'd always conducted interviews. Not interrogations, Not conversations exactly, but the particular kind of listening where you hold the thread loosely and let the other person follow it wherever it goes. Because people almost always knew more than they thought they knew, and the information lived in the details they'd filed away as unimportant. What Brock gave him was not a smoking gun. It was 17 small things spread across 8 months that each made a degree of sense in isolation and only cohered into something significant when you laid them end to end. Scheduling adjustments that Vale had made personally rather than through the coordination team. A security briefing that had been reclassified as confidential after it was circulated at Vale's direction. A request for access to Arabella's private calendar under the justification of threat pattern assessment that Brock had approved because it was within Vale's authority, but that he'd thought about afterward. The private calendar. Mason filed that one carefully. He left Brock with 2 instructions. Don't change any behavior, don't tell Vale about the meeting, and if anything unusual was requested of him in the next 48 hours, text Mason before doing it. Brock agreed. At the door of Fenwick's, he stopped and looked at Mason with the direct look of a man who had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. At the assessment, Brock said, when you... He made a small gesture that encompassed what had happened. I was trying to push you out of the room. I want you to know I understand what that was. I know what it was, Mason said. It's done. Brock nodded once, walked out into the evening. Mason stood outside for a moment in the cool air, running the full picture through his head one more time. Then his phone buzzed, a text from a number he didn't immediately recognize until he read the message and understood it was a burner. Reyes, careful even in a favor. Ashgate Strategic, federal contracting audit 11 years ago. One flagged operation, intelligence brokering on a DoD contract. Audit was closed without findings. One internal name appears in the flag, C. Vale, listed as consulting liaison. Files sealed, but the flag's in the index. That's all I can give you. Mason read it twice. Put the phone in his pocket. C. Vale, consulting liaison. On the intelligence contract that had preceded the mission that killed Daniel Cho. He stood on the sidewalk outside Fenwick's bar with the city moving around him and the weight of 11 years rearranging itself into something that was finally, in the shape it had always been, visible. He was home by 10. Hallie was asleep. He stood in the doorway of her room for a minute, just long enough to confirm she was there and that the apartment was as it should be, then went to the kitchen and stood at the counter with a glass of water he didn't drink and thought about what he needed to do in the next 36 hours before Friday's board meeting. He had the access log analysis. He had Brock's testimony, which was informal but could be formalized. He had Reyes's message, which was off the record but pointed at a documented audit flag. He had the background check anomaly, Vale's own initials clearing his own employment gap. He had the pattern of incidents against Arabella, fully documented, fully time-stamped. What he didn't have was the financial evidence, the money that connected Vale to whoever was on the other side of this, whoever wanted the Meridian contract routed to a specific investor before the board vote. That trail was somewhere in Whitmore's financial system, and he didn't have access to it. He also didn't have the connection between Vale and Declan Whitmore, which had been sitting at the edge of his thinking for days without fully surfacing. Arabella's uncle, her father's younger brother, board member, minority shareholder, a man who had appeared in every photograph from every company event Mason had reviewed but whom he had never once seen speak directly to Arabella at any of them. The conspicuous distance between them. The fact that Declan held enough shareholder influence to shift a board vote if 2 or 3 other members moved with him. The financial trail would connect them. It had to. He was still working through it when his phone rang. Unknown number. He answered it. The voice was a man's, middle-aged, inflectionless in the specific way of people who have learned to keep emotion out of their voice as a professional practice. Mr. Rourke, the voice said, we should talk about your daughter. Mason went very still. Not the stillness of panic, the stillness of someone who has been trained for exactly this kind of moment and whose training takes over before the fear gets a foothold. Who is this? He said. Flat, not a question. Someone who has been watching your situation with some concern. Your daughter attends Millbrook Elementary. She takes the number 7 bus home on Tuesdays. She waits at the corner of Ardell and 9th. A pause. She's been doing that for 2 years. If you were anywhere near my daughter, Mr. Rourke. The voice was patient, almost gentle, which was worse than if it had been threatening. We're not near your daughter. We're simply pointing out that your current activities have created a situation with some collateral risk. You've been asking questions that involve people with significant resources. Those people would prefer you directed your attention elsewhere. Tell those people they can contact me directly, Mason said. They'd prefer not to. They'd prefer this conversation to be enough. Another pause. You have a trial period that ends in 8 days. It would be in everyone's interest if you concluded that your services were no longer needed and moved on. You'd receive a very positive professional reference. Whatever you've been compiling would be understood to have been inconclusive. The voice let that sit for a moment. Your daughter would continue to take the number 7 bus home without incident. Mason said nothing for 4 seconds. He was counting them. You have my answer, he said. Then he ended the call. He was in his car 12 minutes later. He drove to Millbrook Elementary, parked in the lot, sat there for 30 minutes watching the building and the street around it. Nothing moved that shouldn't. No vehicles he recognized. No one on foot in the wrong place. He drove home. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time. He thought about leaving. He didn't allow himself to pretend he didn't think about it, because pretending you weren't considering something was how you ended up surprised by your own decisions. He laid it out honestly. If he walked away, Hallie was safe. The investigation went nowhere. Vale and whoever he was working with achieved what they'd been building toward. Arabella walked into Friday's board meeting without the evidence that could protect her. The Meridian contract went wherever it was supposed to go, and Mason returned to overnight warehouse shifts and the slow mathematics of a thinning savings account. He could live with that. He'd been living with worse for 11 years. He also thought about Daniel Cho, about what Daniel had been like in the last week before the mission. Tired, a little worn down, cracking jokes that had a slightly different quality than his usual jokes. The way people's humor changes when they're carrying something. About the look on Daniel's face in the last 30 seconds, when he'd understood what was happening, when the shape of the betrayal had become clear. Mason had been 40 feet away. He'd been 40 feet away, and he hadn't been able to do anything, and he had been living with that distance for 11 years too. He went to check on Hallie. She was asleep on her side, one arm off the edge of the bed, in the way she'd been sleeping since she was 4 years old. Her backpack was on the floor near the door. There was a drawing on her desk. He could see it in the light from the hallway. A house with a lopsided roof and 2 figures outside it, one tall and one small, the way children drew the things that mattered to them. He stood there for a while. Then he went back to the kitchen table and opened his laptop. She found him there at 6:15 in the morning when she came out for breakfast in her pajamas and found him surrounded by printed documents and empty coffee cups and the specific atmosphere of a man who had been working through the night. Hallie looked at him, looked at the table, looked at him again. "How many cups?" she said. "4. That's too many." "Probably." She got the cereal from the cabinet, got the milk, sat down across from him at the only clear spot on the table. She poured the cereal. She looked at the documents without touching them. "Is it bad?" she said. "It's complicated." "Is that different from bad?" He looked up at her. "Someone called last night. They mentioned you." Hallie put the spoon down. The kitchen was very quiet. "Mentioned me how?" she said. Her voice was careful in the way that children's voices got careful when they were scared but didn't want to show it. "They know your school, your bus route. They were trying to make a point." He watched her face. "Nobody came near you. I checked. You were never in danger. But they wanted you to think I was." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. 9 years old, sitting in her pajamas with her cereal going soft, processing something that no child should have to process, and doing it with the specific steadiness he'd been watching her develop since she was old enough to understand that their life required it. "That means you're close," she said. He frowned slightly. "What?" "If they're trying to scare you away, it means you're close to something they don't want you to find." She picked up her spoon. "Right?" Mason looked at his daughter for a long moment.
Yeah, he said. That's right. So you can't leave. She said it simply, without pressure.
Just a fact that she was naming because it needed to be named. If you leave now, the people who tried to scare you win, and then they'll know that works, and they'll do it to the next person too. Hallie, I'm not saying it's not scary. She met his eyes. I'm saying it's still the right thing. He sat across from her and thought about how 9 years of watching a parent make careful choices in difficult situations could produce someone who reasoned like that. He thought about whether that was something to be proud of or something to worry about. He decided it was probably both. I'm going to need you to go to Aunt Renee's for a few days, he said. His sister-in-law, who lived across town and who Hallie adored, and who would ask no questions if Mason called and said he needed this. Not because you're in danger, as a precaution. Okay, Hallie said. And I need you to not take the bus. Okay. And I need you to not, Dad. She looked at him patiently. I'll be careful. You be careful, too. He reached across the table and squeezed her hand once. She let him, then pulled her hand back and returned to her cereal with the dignified practicality of someone who had things to do this morning. Mason gathered the documents. He had work to do. Oh, he called Arabella at 7:30. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake for a while. I'm coming in, he said. I have enough. A pause. Enough for what? Enough to take to an outside authority, not the board. They're compromised, someone external. But I need one more thing from inside the building first, and I need it before Friday. What do you need? Access to the financial transfer records for Vale's division, specifically anything that routed through an external consultancy in the last 14 months. I think there's a payment structure that connects him to Declan. Silence on the line. Then, that's going to require CFO-level authorization to access. Can you get it? Not without raising a flag that Corbin will see. Mason thought. Who in your finance department do you trust completely? Not professionally. Personally. Another pause, longer this time. My CFO is Hartwell's appointment. I don't know where his loyalties are right now. She stopped. But my internal auditor, a woman named June Castillo, she was my hire. She's been with the company 4 years. She doesn't have an existing relationship with Corbin. Call her directly. Not through the company system. Her personal number, if you have it. I have it. Tell her what you need and tell her to pull it onto a personal device, not the company network. Corbin has access to network activity logs. He paused. And Arabella, don't come into the building today. Work from somewhere else. Tell Petra you have off-site meetings. Why? Because the phone call I received last night means someone is monitoring movement. And if both of us disappear from the building on the same day, it buys time before they recalibrate. She was quiet for a moment. You received a threat? A warning, he said. About Hallie. The silence that followed was a different kind. Mason, she's safe. I've handled it. He kept his voice level. But it tells us we're on the right timeline. They don't make that kind of move unless they're worried about exposure. If they touched your daughter, she's safe, he said again. Focus on Castillo. I need those records by tonight. He hung up, drove toward the building. He spent the morning inside Whitmore moving carefully, doing nothing that looked like anything. He spent time in common areas. He had a 20-minute conversation with Soren about nothing in particular. He reviewed some routine scheduling documentation in the monitoring room and made sure the access log would reflect exactly that. He was, to any observer, a man in the last week of a trial period doing ordinary work. Corbin Vale passed him in the hallway at 10:15 and said good morning. Mason said good morning back. They moved past each other in opposite directions. At noon, Mason went to the parking structure, sat in his car, and called Reyes again. I need one more thing, he said when she picked up. Mason. Her voice was cautious. What I gave you last night was already, I know, this is the last one, the sealed audit on Ashgate Strategic. Is there a case number attached to the internal flag? A long pause. He heard her moving, the sound of a door closing. Yes, she said. Can you get me the supervising officer on that audit? Another pause. That would tell me you're planning to go outside the normal channels. The normal channels are compromised. You don't know that. Reyes. He kept his voice even. I've been doing this for 3 weeks, and I can account for the movement of the Meridian contract to within 72 hours of the board vote. Someone with federal contracting history is inside this company running a structured removal operation against the CEO. The internal channels are not safe. He waited. The officer's name. That's it. That's all I'm asking for. A very long silence. Whitaker, she said finally. D. Whitaker. She retired from the oversight office 2 years ago. I don't have a current contact for her. That's enough. Thank you. He ended the call. Sat in the parking structure, spent 20 minutes on his phone finding a D. Whitaker with a government contracting background, retired 2 years ago, and came up with a woman named Diane Whitaker, who now worked as a private compliance consultant in the city. He found her firm's website, found a contact form. He wrote a very short email from a personal account that had nothing to do with Whitmore Aeronautics. He mentioned the Ashgate Strategic Audit Case Number. He mentioned the flag with Vale's name. He mentioned the Meridian contract and the board meeting date. He wrote, I have documentation. I need 48 hours and a secure channel. He sent it, put the phone away. He drove back toward the building because there was still work to do inside it, and because leaving would look like something he couldn't afford to look like right now. June Castillo delivered the financial records to Arabella at 6 o'clock that evening, printed on paper and carried in a plain manila folder, because Arabella had understood what Mason meant about the network, and had told her auditor exactly that. Arabella forwarded photos of each page to Mason's personal phone at 6:15. He was in his car outside Hallie's school, not because Hallie was there, she'd been dropped at Renee's 3 hours ago, but because it was a quiet location he knew well, with good sight lines, and sometimes you needed a familiar place to do unfamiliar work. He went through the financial records page by page. The payment structure was there. It was layered through 3 intermediate entities, a holding company, a contracted services firm, and what appeared to be a consulting agreement. But the endpoint, when Mason traced it through the account numbers that appeared across the transfers, was a private equity vehicle with a single named beneficial owner. Declan Whitmore. 11 payments over 14 months. Total transfer value just over $400,000, categorized across the intermediate entities as security consulting fees, strategic advisory services, and facilities assessment contracts. None of the work described in the payment records matched anything in Whitmore Aeronautics' operational documentation. The work had not been done. The invoices were fabricated. Declan had been paying Corbin Vale through 3 shell layers for 14 months. The operation to remove Arabella as CEO wasn't a reactive scheme. It had been funded, planned, and running since before Mason had ever walked into the 14th floor waiting room. He photographed each page, sent them to a secure cloud account, wrote the account credentials on a piece of paper that he folded and put in his jacket pocket. Then he called Arabella. She picked up immediately. I have it, he said. The financial connection between Vale and Declan. 14 months of payments. I have account numbers and transfer records. He heard her exhale. A controlled sound. The kind that didn't mean relief yet. Just the release of a pressure that had been building for a long time. Friday is 40 hours away, she said. I know. I made contact with a federal oversight officer this afternoon. If she responds tonight, we have a channel outside the building. If she doesn't respond in time, he paused. We go to the board with what we have and we make the case ourselves. The board has members who are already predisposed to remove me. I know. But the financial records change the conversation. It's not about your leadership anymore. It's about a funded conspiracy to manipulate a board vote. That's a different category of problem, and it implicates people in the room. He paused. Arabella, Declan is going to be at Friday's meeting. A silence. He's a board member. He's a board member who has been paying your security director to dismantle your position for over a year. When we present this, he's going to be in the room. She absorbed that. He could hear her thinking. Will you be there? She said. Yes. The board will object to your presence. Probably,
but I'll be there anyway. A beat. Then, quietly, okay. He stayed in the parking lot for a while after the call ended, watching the streetlights come on one by one as the evening settled over the city. He thought about the 40 hours ahead, about Diane Whitaker and whether she'd respond, about what Friday would look like if she didn't, about the boardroom and Declan Whitmore's face when the financial records hit the table. He thought about Hallie at Renee's, and whether she'd had dinner, and whether she was sleeping okay in a strange bed. He thought about Daniel Cho, about the name C. Vale in a sealed audit index, about the 14 months of fabricated invoices and what they said about the kind of patience required to build something like this from the outside in. The kind of patience that didn't feel remorse, that treated other people's lives as operational variables, that had looked at Daniel Cho and at Mason Rourke and at Arabella Whitmore and had seen only obstacles to be managed. He was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He started the car, drove toward Renee's because he needed to see Hallie before he went home, needed to stand in a doorway for 60 seconds and confirm with his own eyes that she was okay, that the world outside everything he was carrying was still intact and ordinary and safe. It took him 20 minutes to get there. He knocked. Renee opened the door and gave him the look she always gave him, the look that said she understood his life was complicated and she was not going to ask questions and she wished he would eat more. "She's watching something," Renee said. "Can I just—" "Go ahead." He found Hallie in the living room, wrapped in a blanket on the couch, watching something animated on the television. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know. You look tired." "I am tired." She shifted on the couch, making space beside her in the automatic way of someone who has been doing this her whole life. He sat down. She leaned against his arm without any ceremony, the way you leaned against something you trusted completely. They sat like that for a while. The television did its business. The room was warm. "You're going to fix it," Hallie said. Not a question. "I'm going to try." "That's basically the same thing for you," she said. He didn't argue with that. He sat with his daughter in his sister-in-law's living room and let the night accumulate around them, and for a while he was just a father sitting next to his kid, and nothing else was required of him. Then his phone buzzed. A new email. He looked at it. "Mr. Rourke, I remember the Ashgate audit. I've been waiting 11 years for someone to surface that case number. I can be available tomorrow morning. D. Whitaker." He read it twice, put the phone in his pocket. 40 hours. He could work with 40 hours. Diane Whitaker was a small woman in her early 60s who looked like someone who had spent a career being underestimated and had long since decided that was an asset rather than an insult. She met Mason at a coffee shop near the waterfront at 7 in the morning, 24 hours before the board meeting, wearing a gray cardigan and carrying a leather briefcase that looked older than most of the people in the room. She ordered black coffee. She looked at Mason across the table with the direct, unhurried eyes of someone who had been in this kind of conversation before and didn't need it warmed up. "You found the case number," she said. "How?" "Someone who trusted me enough to look at an index." She nodded. The Ashgate audit was closed without findings because 3 of the 4 oversight signatures required to advance it belonged to people who had existing relationships with the firm. I was the 4th signature. I refused to sign the closure. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. 2 weeks later, I was transferred to a different division. 18 months after that, I took early retirement. She paused. I kept copies of everything I was legally permitted to keep. Vale's name is in the flag. Corbin Vale was Ashgate's primary interface on the DoD contract. He wasn't listed as an employee. He was a consultant, which is how he stayed off the formal org chart. But his name appears in 4 internal communications that I documented before the audit was closed. She looked at Mason steadily. "The intelligence that was fed to your team before that mission, it went through Ashgate. Vale was the routing point." Mason had known this. He'd been building toward this conclusion for days. Hearing it said plainly, by someone who had documentation to support it, was still a different thing from knowing it in the private architecture of his own reasoning. It landed somewhere in his chest with a weight that was not quite grief and not quite anger. Something older than both. Something that had been waiting a long time to have a name. He let them go in on bad intelligence, Mason said. The operation was compromised from the intelligence side before it launched. I believe Vale sold the mission parameters to a third party with competing interests. Your teammate... She stopped. I'm sorry, I read what I could access from the incident report. Daniel Cho, Mason said. He said the name the way you said a name you'd been carrying so long it had become part of your breathing. His name was Daniel Cho. Whitaker was quiet for a moment. She didn't offer condolences, which Mason appreciated. She just let the name sit in the air between them with the weight it deserved. What do you need from me for Friday? She said. I need your documentation on the Ashgate audit combined with the financial records I've pulled from inside Whitmore. Together they establish a pattern. Vale has been operating this way for over a decade. The Whitmore operation isn't an isolated case. It's the same methodology applied to a corporate target instead of a military one. Compromised intelligence, manufactured exposure, structured removal of the person in authority. He paused. If I walk into that boardroom with only the Whitmore evidence, they can argue it's internal, corporate dispute. They can contain it. He looked at her. If I walk in with a federal oversight officer who has documented the same methodology from a prior operation, it becomes something they can't contain. Whitaker looked at him for a long moment. You're asking me to walk into a private board meeting and present federal audit documentation. I'm asking you to walk into a room where a man who ended your career and killed my teammate is about to complete a third operation and stop him. He paused. I can't compel you. I'm not in a position to offer you anything. I'm just asking. She looked at her coffee, turned the cup slightly in her hands. Then she looked up. What time? Tetem. Friday arrived with the indifferent punctuality of days that have no idea how much is depending on them. Mason was up before 5. He showered, made coffee, stood at the kitchen window watching the street come alive in the thin early light. He'd slept 3 hours, which was more than he'd expected and enough to function on. He'd been running on less for longer before and knew the particular discipline of a body that keeps working past what the mind thinks it can manage. He called Hallie at Renee's at 6:30. Today's the day, she said. She sounded alert, which meant she'd been up for a while, too. Today's the day, he confirmed. Are you nervous? He thought about that honestly. A little. Good, she said. You make better decisions when you're a little nervous. You told me that. I said that about you. It applies to both of us. A pause. Call me after. I will. Dad? She said it with the particular weight she used when she had something important to deliver. Whatever happens, you did the right thing, even the part where you came back when they tried to scare you away. That was the most important part. He held the phone and didn't say anything for a second. Okay, he said. Okay, she said back, and hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment longer. Then he picked up his jacket, checked his inside pocket for the folded paper with the cloud account credentials, picked up the sealed envelope he'd prepared the night before containing the printed financial records and his full written analysis, and left the apartment. He arrived at Whitmore Aeronautics at 7:45. Whitaker met him in the lobby at 8. Brock Halstead was already there, standing near the security desk in a suit that was slightly too formal for his usual register, which Mason understood as the seriousness of the situation made visible. Brock nodded at him. Mason nodded back. Soren was at the elevator bank. He looked at Mason with the expression of a man who had been briefed on enough to be concerned and not enough to be fully prepared. Vale's already upstairs, Soren said quietly. He came in at 7. He knows something's happening. He's been on his phone since he got here. That's fine, Mason said. Let him know. Arabella was waiting on the 39th floor, in the small conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. She was wearing a charcoal blazer and dark trousers, her hair down today rather than pulled back, which Mason had noticed she did on the days when she was prepared to fight rather than manage. She looked at Whitaker when they came in, and Mason did the brief introduction. Ms. Whitaker spent 11 years waiting to finish a job that was taken from her, Mason said. She's here to finish it. Arabella extended her hand. Whitaker shook it. How many board members can we count on? Mason asked. Arabella pressed her lips together.
Firmly, 3. Possibly 4. Declan has 4 in his corner. The remaining 3 are genuinely undecided. They'll go with whatever the evidence supports. She paused. Assuming the evidence is presented before Declan has a chance to set the frame. Then we go in first, Mason said, before the meeting is formally called to order. That's irregular. Yes. She looked at him, then she looked at Whitaker. Then she looked at the sealed envelope in Mason's hand. All right, she said. Let's go. The boardroom at Whitmore Aeronautics occupied the northeast corner of the 40th floor and had a view that on clear days extended to the water. It was a room designed for decisions, which meant it was also a room designed for power. The long table, the leather chairs, the architectural seriousness of it all. When Mason walked in with Arabella and Whitaker, 6 of the 11 board members were already present. Declan Whitmore was among them, seated 3 chairs from the head of the table. He was 61, silver-haired, with the easy physical confidence of a man who had never seriously questioned his right to occupy space. He looked at Arabella when she entered. He looked at Mason. His expression remained perfectly professionally neutral, which was itself a kind of tell. Corbin Vale was not in the room. The remaining board members filtered in over the next 7 minutes. Mason stood near the wall rather than at the table, which created a mild, visible tension. He wasn't supposed to be here. Everyone in the room understood that. And nobody said it because Arabella was at the head of the table and the meeting hadn't been formally called to order yet. When the last board member was seated, Declan said, Arabella, I think we should discuss the composition of attendees before I'd like to begin, Arabella said. She said it with the particular clarity that didn't leave room for the kind of procedural maneuvering Declan was attempting. What I'm about to present affects the agenda of this meeting significantly, and I think everyone in this room deserves to hear it before we proceed with any formal business. Declan looked at her with the measured patience of a man recalculating. This is irregular. Yes, Arabella said. It is. Mason. Mason placed the envelope on the table. He opened it. He began. He had presented intelligence before, to commanding officers, to mission planners, to people who needed information organized into a form they could act on. He knew how to do it without editorializing, without letting urgency distort the sequence, without giving an audience room to reject the methodology before they'd absorb the substance. He went through it the same way he'd built it. The access log analysis first, then the credential relay structure, then Brock's testimony summarized and attributed, then the background check anomaly with Vale's own initials in the clearance field, then the 17 incident correlations, then the Gala's manufactured emergency, then the financial records. He placed June Castillo's documentation on the table, copies for each board member prepared the night before, and walked through the payment structure. 3 intermediary entities. 14 months. $400,000. Endpoint, a private equity vehicle with Declan Whitmore as the sole named beneficial owner. The room changed. The 3 undecided board members, a woman named Park, a man named Ose, and an older man named Reinhold, who had been on the board since Arabella's father's time, all looked at the financial records with the focused attention of people who understood what they were looking at. Park looked up at Declan. Declan was looking at the documents with an expression that had finally cracked through the neutrality, revealing something underneath that was neither calm nor confident. These records are, Declan started. Authenticated by our internal auditor, Arabella said. June Castillo's signature is on each page. The account numbers have been independently verified against the transfer documentation. This is a fabrication. His voice was still controlled, but the edges of it were showing. Someone has manufactured... Mr. Whitmore. Whitaker spoke for the first time since entering the room. Every head turned toward her. She was still standing near the wall, her briefcase open, a document in her hands. My name is Diane Whitaker. I spent 14 years as a senior officer with the Federal Contracting Oversight Division. 11 years ago, I led an audit of a firm called Ashgate Strategic, which operated on DoD contracts and which employed Corbin Vale as a consulting liaison. She placed her own documents on the table, not copies for everyone, just the originals, set where the nearest board members could see them. The methodology documented in Mr. Rourke's analysis is identical to the methodology I documented 11 years ago. Compromised access, manufactured exposure, structured removal of the principal decision maker. Corbin Vail built this playbook a decade ago. Whitmore Aeronautics is not his first application of it. The room was very quiet. The federal audit was closed improperly, Whitaker continued. I have documentation of that closure and the irregularities that preceded it. I have been in contact with the Oversight Division since yesterday morning. They are reopening the matter. She looked at Declan directly. The financial connection between Mr. Vail and yourself will be part of that inquiry. Declan looked at the documents, at Whitaker, at Arabella. Whatever calculation he was running, it didn't produce a viable result. Mason watched the moment when a man understood that the position he'd been building for 14 months had just collapsed, and that the only variable left was how much of the damage he could limit. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It was actually very quiet. Declan Whitmore looked down at the table and did not look back up for a long time. Board member O.C. said, I'd like to propose that we suspend today's agenda pending an independent review of the materials presented. Seconded, said Park immediately. Reinhold, the oldest board member who had been sitting with his hands folded on the table and his expression unreadable throughout, said quietly, Make it unanimous. He looked at Arabella. I knew your father for 30 years. He would have wanted this handled correctly. He paused. I'm sorry it took this long. Damn. Corbin Vail was located in his office at 9:47, 47 minutes after the board meeting suspended. He had been, by all accounts, on his phone for the preceding 2 hours. When Mason and 2 members of the building's security team came to his office, he was standing at his window with his jacket on and his briefcase on the desk. A man who had understood what was coming and had made peace with the fact that there was nowhere to go. He looked at Mason when the door opened. His expression was the careful blankness of someone who had spent a career managing what his face communicated. Rourke, he said. Vail, Mason said. They looked at each other across the office. The morning light came through the window at an angle that put half of Vail's face in shadow, which was somehow appropriate. Daniel Cho, Mason said. He wasn't asking a question. He wasn't making an accusation for the record. He was just saying the name into the room where the man responsible for it was standing. His name was Daniel Cho. He was 31 years old. He had a sister in Portland and a mother in Albuquerque, and he made the worst coffee of anyone I've ever served with. He paused. You sold the mission parameters for how much? Vail said nothing. I'm not asking for the investigation, Mason said. I'm asking for myself. A long silence. Vail looked at him. Something moved across his face. Not remorse, not exactly, but perhaps the distant cousin of it. The acknowledgement that he was looking at a man whose life had been bent by something Vail had done, and that the bending had been real, whatever justification had made sense at the time. It was a different situation, Vail said. You wouldn't... No, Mason said. I wouldn't. He stepped back. Let the security team move in. Watch them escort Vail out of the office, past the desk with the briefcase on it, down the hallway he'd walked every day for 7 years. Mason stood in the empty office after they were gone and looked at the window and the view beyond it. The city doing its ordinary business, entirely unaware of what had just happened on the 40th floor. He stood there for a minute. Just a minute. Then he turned and walked out. The independent investigation that followed took 11 weeks. It was thorough in the way investigations are thorough when the people conducting them have both the mandate and the evidence. Not perfect, not without its frustrating delays and procedural tangles, but thorough. Corbin Vail was removed from his position on the first day and was subsequently the subject of both a civil action by Whitmore Aeronautics and the reopened federal inquiry that Diane Whitaker had set in motion. The federal matter would take longer. These things always did, but it was moving, which was what mattered. Declan Whitmore resigned from the board 6 days after the emergency session before the independent review formally requested his cooperation, which told everyone who needed to know something about the strength of his position. The civil implications of the financial records were significant. His attorneys were busy. Brock Halstead was exonerated completely. Mason had put that in writing in the clearest possible terms in the first formal document he submitted to the independent review. Brock's cloned credential, the mechanism by which the frame had been constructed, was documented and attributed correctly. Brock returned to his role as senior security specialist, and there was a different quality to how he moved through the building after that. Something less armored, more considered. He stopped performing capability and started exercising it, which turned out to be a considerable improvement. Mason's military record was the last thing to be addressed, and it took the full 11 weeks. The federal inquiry, in the course of reopening the Ashgate audit, examined the intelligence failure that had preceded the operation in which Daniel Cho had died. The examination was not public. The conclusions were not announced in any press release. But a letter arrived at Mason's apartment on a Wednesday afternoon. Official government letterhead, which stated in the careful, qualified language of bureaucratic acknowledgement that the record of the incident in question had been reviewed, that the findings attributed to Mason Rourke had been found to be unsupported by the available evidence, and that his military service record had been amended accordingly. He sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times. Hallie, who was doing homework across from him, watched him read it and didn't ask anything because she had learned to read his silences well enough to know which ones needed space. After a while, she said, "Good news or complicated news?" "Both," he said. She nodded like that was the answer she'd expected. "Do you want to talk about it?" "Not yet." "Okay." She returned to her homework. He folded the letter, put it on the table, looked at it. 11 years. 11 years of carrying something that had not been his to carry, of living in the long shadow of a record that said he had failed when the truth was that he had been betrayed. 11 years of quiet and careful living, the warehouse shifts, the overnight jobs, the careful management of a life that had been diminished by something that was not his fault and that he had never been able to say out loud. He thought about what it felt like to put something down after carrying it that long, and the answer was that it didn't feel like relief. Not exactly. It felt more like the moment when your eyes adjust after coming in from the dark. Not a sudden brightness, but a slow and ordinary clarification. Things becoming visible that had been there all along. He thought about Daniel Cho, and for the first time in a long time, he thought about him without the accompanying weight of guilt. Just the person. The terrible coffee. The laugh that had been too loud for any situation he deployed it in. The way he'd talked about his sister's kid with the particular helpless affection of a man who had not expected to become an uncle and had found it quietly changed him. Mason sat at the kitchen table and let himself remember his friend like a friend without the other thing underneath it. It took a while, but it was possible. That was new. Tabbed. Arabella called 2 weeks after the letter arrived. Not about business. The Meridian contract had been reevaluated and advanced correctly through the board. The security division was being rebuilt under new oversight, and Mason's formal involvement with Whitmore Aeronautics had concluded when the independent review completed its work. She called his personal number in the evening, and he answered. "How's Hallie?" she asked. "Back on the number 7 bus," he said, under protest about the 2 weeks she missed. Arabella laughed. A real one, not the professional version he'd heard her use in meetings. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "We're launching a program for former military and security professionals rebuilding civilian careers. Resources, placement support, some funding for retraining." A pause. "It was something I'd been thinking about for a while. Your situation made it concrete." "That's a good thing," he said. "I thought you might want to be involved in an advisory capacity." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking." She paused again. There was a different quality to the silence. Less professional, more like two people who had been through something together and were figuring out what that meant now that the something was over. "Mason, the offer to become permanent security director is still open. It'll stay open." "I know," he said, "but you're not going to take it." "No." She seemed to consider that without disappointment. "What are you going to do?" He looked around the kitchen. The note he'd left on the counter for Hallie that morning, the grocery list on the refrigerator door in his handwriting, and Hallie's both, different pens, different loops, the specific ordinary texture of an evening at home. "Something that lets me be home for dinner," he said. Arabella was quiet for a beat. Then, "That seems right." They talked for a while longer, easily, without the particular tension of people managing a professional situation. When they hung up, Mason sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, thinking about something he couldn't quite articulate. The way some things ended cleanly and others just changed shape. The way people who had been through hard things together carried that forward in some form. Not as a burden, but as a kind of knowing, a shared reference point for what the other person was made of. He put the phone down, went to knock on Hallie's door. "Dinner," he said through the door. 5 minutes. "Now." A pause. 3 minutes. "Hallie?" She appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone demonstrating patience. "I'm literally in the middle of a sentence." "Finish the sentence," he said. She disappeared back into her room. He went to start dinner, pasta again, because it was Tuesday, and that was the Tuesday thing, and stood at the stove with the cracked spatula and the routine of it, the ordinary physical fact of being in this kitchen, making this meal for this particular person, and thought about how underrated that was, how easy it was to move through it without seeing it, how he intended to be less that way going forward. Hallie appeared in the kitchen doorway 2 minutes later, homework done, looking at him with the expression she used when she was going to say something that she already knew he'd resist. "Mrs. Orellana said there's a parent volunteer day next month," she said. "You could come." "What would I do at a parent volunteer day?" "Be a parent. Volunteers." She shrugged. "Other dads do it." "Other dads have different skill sets." "You could read to the little kids," she said, "or do the thing where you talk about your job." "My job is complicated to explain." "Former job," she said. "Your former job is cool. You don't even have to say all the secret parts." He looked at her across the kitchen, his daughter, who had submitted a job application on his behalf because she believed in him before he believed in himself, who had told him on a morning when he almost walked away that doing the right thing was still the right thing even when it was scary, who had his stubbornness and her mother's compass, and something entirely her own that he couldn't name but recognized. "I'll think about it," he said. She smiled, so the full version, the one she didn't deploy strategically. "That means yes. It means I'll think about it." "Okay," she said, meaning the same thing he did. 4 months after this board meeting, on a Saturday morning in late autumn, Mason drove to Whitmore Aeronautics. Not because he was called there, not because there was work. He drove there because he'd been thinking about the first day, the walk across the lobby, the elevator to the 14th floor, the waiting room full of people who looked through him. And he wanted to see the building as what it was now rather than what it had been then. He parked in the visitor lot, walked to the entrance, signed in at the front desk because he no longer had a badge, and the lobby guard, a young woman he didn't recognize, handed him a visitor sticker with the professional courtesy of someone doing her job well. He stood in the lobby for a minute, just stood there. The marble floors were the same, the high ceilings, the soft sound of recirculated air, but the camera angles had been corrected. He could tell from the positioning, the coverage that no longer left the gaps he'd cataloged on his first morning. Someone had done the work. Small thing. Nobody else would notice it. He noticed it. He was at the elevator when he heard someone say his name. He turned. Arabella was crossing the lobby from the direction of the north entrance in a coat and no briefcase, looking like someone who had come in on a Saturday for reasons she was comfortable with not explaining. She stopped a few feet away. "I didn't know you were coming," she said. "I didn't plan it," he said. She looked at him. He looked at her. It was the particular quality of looking at someone you have seen at their most pressured, their most frightened, their most resolute, and knowing they have seen the same in you. A different kind of familiarity than most. Less polished and more real. "Are you coming up?" she said. "No," he said. "I just wanted to see it." She understood that, or seemed to. She glanced around the lobby, at the cameras, the entrance, the desk guard doing her job well. "It's different," she said. "Better," he said. She nodded. "Are you okay?" "Generally." "Generally?" he said. "Yeah." He thought about it for a second. "I'm taking Hallie to her soccer thing this afternoon. She's terrible at it. She keeps apologizing to the other kids when she fouls them." Arabella's mouth curved. "That sounds like her." "She's thinking about joining the school debate team," Mason said. "I feel like I'm in trouble."
Arabella laughed again. That real one. You are absolutely in trouble. They stood in the lobby of a building where a lot had happened, in the way that ordinary-seeming buildings sometimes held things that had altered the trajectories of the people inside them. Outside, the city was doing its Saturday morning thing, unhurried, ambient, indifferent to the specific gravity of the space they were standing in. I'll be in touch about the advisory program, Mason said. I think I can make time for it. Good, Arabella said, simply. He said goodbye, walked back across the lobby, past the security desk, through the main entrance, and out into the autumn morning. He got in his car. He didn't sit there this time, didn't pause in the lot to run things through his head. He started the car and drove because he had somewhere to be. A soccer field across town, a kid who apologized for fouls, an afternoon that required nothing of him except to be present in it. He drove through the city with the window down a little, enough to let the air in, enough to feel the ordinary fact of a Saturday moving around him.
For 11 years, Mason Rourke had operated in the discipline of pure forward motion. One foot, then the other, no looking back, no standing still long enough for the weight to catch up with him. It had kept him functional. It had also kept him at a particular distance from his own life, like a man watching his own story through a window rather than living inside it. He understood now that forward motion and being present were not the same thing, that you could move constantly and still be standing in the past, that the real discipline, harder than anything he'd trained for, was learning to be in the present moment without the armor, without the exit strategy, without the part of yourself that was always already watching for the next threat. He was not there yet. He knew that. He was working on it in the incremental, imperfect way that real changes happened, not in a single decisive moment, but in 1,000 ordinary ones, each day choosing to show up more fully than the day before. But this morning, driving toward a soccer field, he was not checking for exits. He was just driving. The road ahead of him, the air through the window, the ordinary, complicated goodness of a life that was still, despite everything, his. That was enough. For the first time in a long time, that was genuinely enough.